Is it surprising to see that so many people have actually had office relationships?
Well, what I was particularly interested in was looking at how different it was between the generations. So because over the last 10 years you've had the rise of dating apps, you've also had the Me Too movement, and you've had the pandemic. Now, they've all affected the office romance in their own different ways. So I was quite intrigued to see whether how much it had impacted. And actually, it was quite surprising that 1 in 3 Gen Zs, so those under 24, have already had a relationship in the workplace, which shows that the workplace is still a kind of key driver of romance and so on. It's the third place where people meet a partner after friends and family and a pub or bar setting.
Now, your poll found that 51% of employees thought that employers should provide some sort of guidance over this. How was that stratified across the different generations?
Yeah, so I was quite surprised at how high that was, but I think this is an example of kind of the Me Too movement of where, you know, people want a bit more guidance. Obviously, flirting is a very subjective term, and it comes part of company culture, which is such a kind of big driver of trying to recruit people. And so the interesting side on that was actually 18 to 24s were the least in favour of workplace guidance when it came to flirting. Still above 40%, so still high, but they were against it. Probably, I think they don't like the idea of ex-cos around the country in their 40s and 50s, their parents' age, deciding what they should and shouldn't be allowed to do when it comes to flirting.
But that's interesting, because you'd think that sort of 18 to 24-year-olds might be the most right-on Me Too kind of generation, and yet they're against this sort of corporate culture of telling people how to behave.
Yeah, exactly. I was struck by that. And also, men were actually more in favour than women of flirting, of guidance around this as well. So that also sort of slightly struck me. But across the board, it was high, and companies are putting more and more time into trying to get these things right.
Now, interestingly, 37% said that flirting is appropriate in the workplace, meaning that a considerable majority thought that it isn't. What should we read into that?
Well, I think that's part of the sort of, you know, Me Too sort of rise over the last few years, and I think it's a very subjective term, isn't it, flirting? You know, what is flirting to one person compared to another? So I think that was is quite a big sort of point on that. But at the end of the day, when you've had 40% of people that have had some sort of office romance, and interestingly, 20% of those people have never told anyone, which might be quite interesting. But I think, you know, it is something that companies actually do need to sort of take seriously and work out, you know, what their policies are.
The other point about this is different roles might seem more attractive and others might seem less attractive. Interestingly, it was health and law that were sort of at the top of the table. But right down there at the bottom, very few people, just 22% of people found that government roles, that civil service roles, were a turn-off. Do people just not fancy MPs?
Well, I think that's, you know, coming from my world, it was quite startling to see that was one of the most undesirable sectors alongside retail and hospitality in terms of maintaining a relationship. And I think it is because, you know, MPs work, you know, incredible hours, as do the civil service, as do those in retail and hospitality as well. You know, these are hard jobs that are demanding and will be requiring people to work this evening, for example, so maybe not able to make time for Valentine's Day. But it was interesting to see healthcare at the top of the most desired. I wonder if that's part of pandemic, you know, and sort of, you know, we praise the NHS workers, etc. But actually a real sort of tangible thing that's come out is an increase in respect for those kind of key workers.
It's almost like there's sort of a social value, a cachet to being in a relationship with someone who does something socially useful. Yes. Although right next to that is lawyers, which and lawyers don't always necessarily have the highest of reputations, but I suppose that's just a financial point.
Yes, I suppose, and finance is quite high up there as well, so that's true. But interestingly, health and fitness, so slightly different from healthcare, but was also ranked higher. That's obviously probably got some other attractions to it. But I think it's really, it is interesting here. We define so much of who we are from our job and the kind of status that brings. And that's one of the key things that we were doing with the polling, is that we all go to job for financial reward, but actually there's a lot of ancillary benefits that we get from that as well. Camaraderie with colleagues, you know, flirting with colleagues in this instance, but also that sort of status and purpose. And I think that's really important. And that's what we try to get across in Jimmy's Jobs of the Future podcast.
Now, interestingly, Jimmy's Jobs of the Future does look forward as well as what's going on at the moment. And one of these questions really struck me. It was about the proportion of people who would date a robot. 1 in 8 would would be comfortable dating a robot. Did that surprise you?
It did. It was that high, yes. But I think, it's interesting with the rise of Chat GPT and Alexa and so on, that these are coming into people's lives a lot more, and people aren't sort of, for people that are lonely and so on, I think they have become quite interesting kind of companions, particularly in the elderly and so on. I mean, I was surprised that you put romantic in front of it and it's still that high, but I think it is this interesting thing. We are seeing this huge technological revolution take place, and the rise of robots is going to become very real. And again, we are going to have relationships with them in different ways, and where does romance start and all that, and would you flirt with your robot, etc., to kind of bring a couple of the points together. I think it'll be sort of fascinating to kind of see where we go.
Really fascinating and slightly concerning, I suppose, given that there is a bit of an epidemic of loneliness. There is this sort of movement of incels, involuntarily celibate people, and some of these people have been committing terrorist crimes and all the rest of it. Might the way that robots sort of plug into that be something that could help solve this, or might that be a turn towards some sort of dystopia?
I mean, it could be either, couldn't it? I mean, we are right at the foothills of this kind of AI revolution, and viewers that have played with Chat GPT or yourself just can see that it's going to be a huge thing of our economy in the next 10 years. And I do think there needs to be a national conversation about, regulation. Should it be regulated? Do we need global regulation in it, and so on? Because this is on par with kind of the internet, and we didn't get everything right necessarily with those in the early days. So it will be fascinating to kind of see how policymakers tackle it.